can see, I've got the agenda pulled up. It's a profiling call today, but yes, to Joni's question, we probably should talk a little bit about what the next few weeks look like, both on the profiling side and the governance side, for whether or not we'll host. We'll have to make the same ask of the governance folks as well, even though I know a lot of us are wearing both hats and attend both calls. But so unless we hear, no one is joining for the governance call on the 20th, which is next Friday, we'll open it up. I think the goal for our next governance call was going to be to continue the walkthrough of kind of the Australian model for base and core together, and then to maybe see if we can get and dig into like the Netherlands model a little bit. Basically discovery, evaluating kind of how they are handling the relationship between both of their bases and cores or equivalents. But I anticipate that's going to be probably at least 2 governance sessions, especially if we don't get through the entirety of the Netherlands kind of review next week. So I think what that means is that we really are looking at, well, first I'll make the call, which is to say, like, is anyone planning to attend the next, on the 20th, which would be the next governance call?
If it's happening, I'll be there.
All right.
I should be able to be there.
Okay.
Yeah, same with me.
Okay. I think if we've got like 2 or 3 folks and we've got folks that are interested in the reviews, and even like we record everything. So that will be the other, it's not going to be many on actioning or decisioning. So if folks are starting their breaks early, they won't miss out, I think, on any like votes, but they could catch up that way.
Yeah, it sounds like worth going back and listening to the recording from last time when I was off the take your parent to work day.
Yeah. Yeah. So the fact that it's available on YouTube, I think, should make it easier. What I will say is I will be off the 27th. I haven't talked to Mike about it. And I know a lot of folks typically take like time, especially between like right leading up to the new year, off as well. Is there anyone that wants to attend a profiling call on the 27th and or would be interested in hosting?
I know both
I
Kai
would.
and InfoWay offices are closed that week.
Yeah, I will not be on a call on the 27th.
No. Elliot, I heard you say something.
I was just kidding.
Oh, okay. Just jumping at the bit to be able to host the 27th call. We could just get on and drink hot cocoa and not talk about FHIR. But okay, so I'm not hearing anyone that's saying yes, I'd like to join on the 27th. We'll probably, and that's our next profiling call, which leaves, I think, the 3rd. So January 3rd, I think some folks are off the 1st and the 2nd. Is anyone, will anyone be joining on the 3rd?
No, I am off. Yes.
Yeah, I'm off on the 3rd.
Shall we take what would that be, a 2-week hiatus and rejoin? What would be back to profiling, which would keep our sequencing, which might be nice, January 10th.
That works for me.
Yeah.
Can be fine.
Technically, I'm not back until the 14th, but that's just me.
Jealous, Randy. Wow. Okay. Okay. So governance call on the 20th. And then we'll be canceling the calls on the 27th and 3rd and resuming on the 10th so it's profiling, governance, profiling with profiling call. Yep. On January 10th. Okay. So my goal was, and I didn't think it at the beginning of the month, it felt that crazy, but now I'm thinking, especially after reviewing the issue log today, it might be a little bit tight. My hope was to get before January, the 1.2 package out. But what it might mean is that we're still putting in some changes on January 10th when we reconvene. But with with kind of trying to keeping things in mind of like, hey, we should be marching towards, you know, our commitments and trying to get the changes in, especially ones that have been already actioned. I thought it makes sense for us to go through some of the ones, particularly like diagnostic report, which has like a lot of action, the tickets that are like ready to be applied, but also a bit wordy and harder for somebody to just like pick up and know exactly what change to apply. So I singled that one out for like actual application today. And there's I'll start with a list, but one of the things I did want to call out just off the start, we've been kind of reviewing these outstanding tickets and just like a high level dashboard at the beginning of the meetings. And I was noticing something when I was doing like the counts 2 weeks ago that like our overall count was like showing 41, but when I was using the filters on Simplifier, I was only getting like only 2 in the submitted category, and there were a few, like it just didn't total up. And I'm not sure why this is. I don't know if other people have experienced this, but I went in today and I looked at just confirming the counts. And what I noticed is the time I applied the filter this time was when we actually saw some of those, like it was like an additional 12 ones that were in the overall count that I wasn't able to see previously. So what that means is effectively just that some of these may already be resolved. I found out about it about 20 minutes ago, but we may not make our 2024 before the new year deadline for getting out 1.2. But I don't know if a week or 2 is going to make a big difference for folks. So with that in mind, I think it makes sense to just try to apply some of the ones that are like people have been waiting a very, very long time for, that we have already made our way through. What I will say is if folks have a chance to take a look and take a peek at the submitted ones, there may be ones that we've already actioned out. If you see anything that we have actioned out, let us know and we'll kind of close out the ticket or essentially re-tag it. If, for example, it was like one that we previously talked about as maybe it's consideration for future use. But in trying to essentially just make our way through the list, we've got a bunch of the ones from diagnostic report pulled up that I think are ready to act on, if that makes sense to folks. And the doubles as I'm going through the process, you'll have a sense of, I know there were some folks that were interested in kind of like the editing process. And so this will also kind of give you a sense of, okay, so when I see that there's a ticket, what's the step that I follow through with, you know, creating a branch on GitHub, and I'm kind of going from there. So hopefully that I think we had a couple volunteers last time, and if there are other folks that are interested in now actually having a recording that shows kind of some of the step-by-steps, will be a little bit helpful for others. So I pulled up some of the diagnostic report. We've got like, I think a total of five. And I can actually, I'm just going to navigate to it from the actual, so I'll show you it with, and this is the diagnostic report specifically for results. So most of these are, we'll do all open statuses, are ready to be applied. There's a few that have been kind of like they're on the back burner awaiting community feedback that we've kind of effectively put out there, but aren't expecting to make changes to in the 1.2 release. A lot of them, like there's a couple where it's like it's talking about the same type of element. And some of them, the 5th one I'm hoping we can get to today is around an extension. So I thought what we might do is just kind of go through it. I'll walk through the process of, you know, when I am editing on my computer, what that looks like in terms of like interacting with the overall repository, and then we'll actually just physically apply the changes on the call. So I have the GitHub repository up, and you folks probably used to kind of seeing this, but I'll put this in the chat. to start. This is our GitHub repository that basically houses the actual, all of the profiles that feed into Simplifier and feed into our implementation guide that is the CI build that exists online. And we manage changes, particularly changes that are done from our community of editors through branches. And sometimes like somebody might want to use a branch to trial something out and to kind of or they might like fork the repository to tweak some things that aren't necessarily action items and changes that need to occur, but they want to play around with a baseline. But most of the time when you are a community editor that's like pick something off of the issue log that is ready to be applied, right? And that has, for example, a action item in it, labeled AI is my shorthand for that. Your first step is going to be going to the GitHub repository and creating a branch off of the master. You can really do it a couple different ways. You can create, you can kind of open the repository on your desktop and create a new branch through that mechanism, right? Where if I was going to go to the master branch, open with GitHub desktop, and then create it from this interface, which is what I use to manage any of my edits that I make locally. You can create, like once it's been created on your desktop and opened up that way, you have the option of contributing and editing in any one of these or creating a new branch. I'm going to physically create a new branch from this view, and then because I think it's probably most likely what other editors are used to kind of going through. And the reason that we've used branches in the past is that it just kind of allows for us to, one, have multiple people working at once. And I tend to also like it because it's a nice way of kind of grouping similar types of edits together, as opposed to like having just like Sheridan's branch where I might have things that are like halfway done and things that aren't quite ready to publish and things that are. By trying to isolate this and say, okay, I'm going to work on tickets that are related to slicing, or I'm going to work on tickets that are related to, I think we just closed out one recently on like the stub value sets. It just creates that nice compartmentalization. My branch is going to be diagnostic report. And I'm just probably, let's see. I will put the name of the tickets that we're going to be addressing. So it's like 2502, 2487, 2192, 2186, and 21742. Okay. So these are our ticket numbers in like this. So these are the things that like we're applying to diagnostic report. And the reason I like doing this is it also gives me traceability into the step that happens after you make the change, which is to essentially close out the ticket in GitHub, or I'm sorry, close out the ticket in Simplifier. So as simple as creating a new branch, naming it. I am now going to, let's see if I'm actually probably going to close this out. I created it off the main, which is, by the way, the thing that is like our CI build. So the main branch, when I made that decision, as opposed to creating it off of another branch, is the process that we'd encourage other editors to follow. So now I've created this thing, which is right now just a pure copy of our main branch. And I want to now open this on my desktop so that I can make edits with like my text editor and edit the branch and contribute into that branch as opposed to the main. And one of the reasons that we do that is because whenever we have, edits that are occurring, we always want to make sure that we've got like a secondary reviewer that when you commit the change to the branch and then request a pull request to merge the changes into main, there's like that step where somebody's looking at it, they're kind of running through the changes on their own local machine, and that like ultimately they have the intent of preventing any changes that could be resulting in like a fail that would make our CI builds go down from slipping through to the main branch. So what I'm going to do, you can see I've got like a little bit of a playground right now in the slicing and stub remodeling branch. I'm just going to switch over and I'm going to leave the changes. This is less applicable if you haven't been playing around. But basically what I want to do is I want to start fresh with whatever is in the main that I'm going to be editing, because that's what I'm going to contribute back to. So what that's done, because what I've done previously is I've opened up and created this file in my machine called CA baseline. So basically when I created the repository, I then opened up that repository and said, this is the place on my desktop where that repository should live. Now there is synchronization between the folder and the changes that I make and what can be contributed up to GitHub. So anytime, if we look in my little GitHub viewer, anytime, let's say I'm going to open up, I'm going to actually, because I know there's a change that I have to apply to make my thing run. I'm going to open up like my resources, and actually I'm going to see it from this view, I think. It's not that one, it's this one. If I open up any of these, if I make a change, let's say let's just make one as simple as the first change that we make, which is updating the date to indicate some changes occurred. The next time I open up my little web client, I can see, oh, this is what has changed from what exists on GitHub today that I would ultimately be putting in as commits into this particular branch that I just created. So I really like it because it also helps me give that like final view of what's changed before I get ready for that commit and make that change. So I know I've closed out everything that the ticket is indicated. But you can see like, because we've set it up this way, because I've got this file that when I opened the repository for the first time on my desktop, I saved it to this location. Everything flows through after that. So I've updated the date. I'm just going to quickly update the version. This I think typically gets written over in IG Publisher, but I still use it as an indicator to prove that something has changed. And I'm just going to go through now, close out some of the stuff that we don't need to look at right now. And I am going to be looking at the ticket and applying changes. Let's get this guy over here. That we have in our tickets. So I already know which ones are going to be targets because I've narrowed them to diagnostic report. And I'm looking for any of the tickets that are ready to be applied. So the first one is typically anything that's ready to apply will have will typically have at least 2 comments. The first is the comment describing the actual initial request and any discussion typically that we've had. Sometimes discussion might carry over through in the second comment, and then the actual change. So we have some rationale and the options that were considered, and then the choice that was decided upon by the particular on the profiling call that this issue was reviewed. So this one's super easy. It's a change to the cardinality that has been applied on, where is it? Effective. And that's here. And the idea is that we've applied a minimum cardinality, and for some reason we've applied max and indicated in the differential when we don't have to. And the choice that is to be actioned upon is to relax it back to its base level. So for us, that's going to be a removal of any claim of cardinality in the differential. So now it will populate with whatever is, from the base resource. There's another one that's on effective. Let's see. That was around must support. And this was around, let's see a little bit more on the rationale. So I think the idea behind removing effective must support was that there are scenarios where it looks like there are different dates for information that makes up the diagnostic report. But what we basically said is, because we reviewed it, I'm guessing this is against OLIS and a couple other like lab-based implementations, that it's not consistently applied. And it looks like we don't necessarily want it to be must support across all of these spaces if we think there are going to be business scenarios and use cases where effective just doesn't come into play for diagnostic report. So the other change I'm going to make here is removing that must support that's been applied in the differential, and just making sure that my JSON is correct. So I know with these two tickets, I'm gonna have to do a little bit of cleanup. I didn't, in showing you guys the walkthrough as like from an editor's perspective, I know I have to make one more change to the guide to make it run. So I'm going to do that really quickly, which is a change to remove goal, because there was a breaking change in it that we actioned previously. So I just have to make this in the branch. But after making, the reason I'm doing it now is that I want to show you guys the step that we'll typically take, which is to like run major changes through IG Publisher as we're making them, to make sure that we know we're not radically creating a spaghetti of issues that we can't kind of trace back to the changes that we've made. So like I mentioned, I'm going to do this for my local one, but we'll track it separately, but I just need it to run right now. So what that meant was I needed to remove it from the implementation guide file. I needed to remove it from the actual list of profiles. And now when I run through IG Publisher, I'll have a good idea of if anything that I just did, which I don't anticipate it would, to diagnostic report, will create a problem for me. So I'm going to save this saved, and we'll just continue making changes as we go while IG Publisher runs in the background and validates that the guide builds the way we want it to. Okay, so let me actually see. I think I'm not logged in. I don't know why. We just need to refresh. Oops. Okay. So we know that this one had an action item on effective for removing the must support. What I'll typically do if I'm doing multiple tickets at once is I'll just indicate like the date. And I would indicate, actually, sometimes I think I do it this way as my convention. Applied in commit. Once I commit it, and I have a PR, and I'll sometimes indicate that as well. And I'll just comment this out. What's the other one? I think it was this one. Okay. And then we can keep working through the other ones before we push those changes into the branch and create a pull request. Okay. Let's see, there's might be one other one. So this was the one actually I think we talked about last week. Or two, when was that? A number of weeks ago. So this was around reference targets, and it was specifically, so it's modifying the title, which is the first part of the motion. And I guess for folks that are reviewing the tickets, you might see a motion or you might see AI. Action item is what we used before we started formally calling them motions. and started formally taking votes. And motions is effectively the same thing. It's ready to be applied. There's been a change that's called out and distinct. So we're going to change the title, and we're going to remove some of the constraints that we have on the reference targets. For, I guess it's these actually scenarios. Okay. So while that's still running, the title, oh, I think this was to specifically call out laboratory results reporting. And we'll just make sure it's not showing up anywhere else. Laboratory and other results, that looks good. Our XML file will sometimes also include title information. So if you get a ticket that looks like this, know that chances are you should check both the, well, 3 places: the profile itself, the IG file, which is the CA baseline XML, which lists out, you know, these are the profiles that are in scope, as well as any of the markdown pages, which we'll look at together in a second. All right. And the name of this one is actually, so we're going to copy that over. Okay. And then I'm just going to make sure by going to the page content, which is where our markdown files are housed, I'm also going to make sure that the title, if it needs to be updated in diagnostic report pages, that it's there. Okay, so it's this one and probably the other one. Laboratory results is already called out. Brilliant. And then, so our markdown files for each of the profile pages are typically like broken up into 2 sections. And that's because of a customization of the template that we performed to allow for essentially text to be distributed across 2 locations on the page. So we've got the first one, intro, which is the very beginning of the page, and then notes is what falls below actually the profile rendering. So diagnostic report notes. We're just going to make sure, I don't think there's any title information in this. Okay, so we don't necessarily, or hold on, we don't have to actually modify that one. All right, so the second part of this, which is to expand the reference targets above to also allow for referencing of our diagnostic report notes profile. So this is actually a change in these resources, because right now, if we were to open those up, let's open up procedure real quick. What we would see is that even though we have a profile that's supposed to cover purely labs for diagnostic reports, and then notes, which is everything else in this, these bullets, so we have 2 distinct profiles. We only call out one of the profiles in this reference target. And that's meaningful because there might be different constraints on our diagnostic report note profile that need to be distinct and may not actually follow necessarily with what is in our general lab profile. You know, the reason they're separated is because they're intended to apply different constraints. The reason that this is meaningful when it's applied to something like procedure, and I apologize if this is retreading ground with you guys, because I know a lot of you folks probably were on this call, but the reason it's meaningful is because if I go to procedure real quick, when we constrain a reference target here, on any of these, any place where we profile and say, you're going to use a baseline profile here. If we don't have the base resource or like all noted as a allowable reference, it means that only instances that conform to these profiles are allowed. And because what we know is that with procedure, it may be that the procedure is referencing a diagnostic report for cardiology, which would use the diagnostic report note profile, that by having the, or actually, maybe was it this one? Yeah, by having it only point to one and not the other, actually potentially precludes our ability for real implementation scenarios where someone needs to reference a cardiology diagnostic report, would be precluded because of that choice. And I think that was something that when we were profiling originally, we didn't really realize the impact of like specifically narrowing these targets and not allowing for a multitude of options. So it's a really powerful tool if you want to be able to truly say it's not conformant if it doesn't meet one of these, but very frequently, particularly in base guides and sometimes even in core guides, the goal is not necessarily like, is to be the right level of prescriptive while recognizing that there are variations in our clinical workflows that sometimes necessitate the ability to provide all, not just data that sometimes doesn't meet one of these criteria, but sometimes I've seen it in the baseline where we've actually slimmed out a particular type of resource, thinking, oh, well, we didn't profile for it, and it actually removes it entirely, which is carries a lot of weight, has a lot of impact if for some reason you say you can no longer supply a device for this element. So the way that we're going to fix this is that we're going to get the diagnostic report note canonical in any of the places that we know it's the diagnostic report lab profile is used as well. And so let me get the canonical real quick. We have it here. And when I go to add it into the reference target, I just had that. Open it again. I'm going to add it right below. And so now effectively we're saying, regardless of what type of diagnostic report you're doing, you're going to fall under one of these two categories for our profile. So both are allowed. We don't have a reason in the base to say, for some reason, procedures are not allowed to talk about imaging diagnostic reports, for example. I found, let's see, I think we put it in the ticket. I think we found it in a couple different places. So we're going to perform this additional step on immunization. And I would highly recommend, if you guys haven't done this already, to kind of go scan through your own guides and like with that lens of reference targets and like knowing, oh, when I slim this by just not noting it as a target in the target profile in my differential, like, is that what I actually originally intended? Because it's one of those sticky areas, or like, I think we originally interpreted it differently in the baseline than it actually operates. So that's the change to immunization, medication statement, medication administration. Okay. And there was one other one, service request. All right. So I'll pull up so this was the change that we made, the really simple one just before this, just confirming that that built okay. So our next change is to that title and to the actual, some of the other supportive resources here. I almost forgot, and it is easy to do this. Someday they'll come up with a faster way of doing this, so that it does this as we're doing it. I will just quickly make that modification to the dates. It's almost like if I was smarter, I would have just copied and pasted this. Okay. And procedure. Okay. I think there's one other easier profiling change, that is on category that we might put in before running this one more time, just to see if we can get the straightforward ones out the way. Okay, so there's a lot of chatter on this one. I see one. This is around category slice. So I'm going to close out a procedure, diagnostic report category. So there's a slice on lab results to basically say if your diagnostic report is a lab result, you're going to be utilizing this as your coding system for category, for the category element. This one actually is more of a comment. So let's go back to it after we get to the actual change, which is basically saying that either must support or cardinality needs to be made. And at this call, we said lessen the cardinality on the category parent element. So not the slice necessarily, but this one. So we've got that there. And putting a constraint on slice or coding to carry conditional expectation on using slice pattern of lab results if category is supported in a later implementation, with a comment or usage note pointing readers to the MS subsection on modeling constraints in child elements. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is remove our constraint on the parent element for category. And I think I mentioned this earlier, in a lot of places for some reason when we were first putting this out, we included the max, even though this is the same max as what's in the base resource. I'm removing both at once, because as particularly at the parent element level, it's unnecessary. It'll just fill in the blanks for me. But then it's also putting the constraint on slice or coding to carry conditional expectation that using slice pattern if category is supported. So there might be a couple ways of interpreting that, and I'll bring this back to you guys. So now what we basically said is we've only said we're going to lessen the cardinality, so it still must support, but in this case, because and this was something we also learned in the last 6 months, that the interpretation of having one of your slices be a minimum one of cardinality implies that that there is also a secondary minimum cardinality on the parent element. When we were originally modeling, the idea was you might have a parent element that's optional, but if you do populate it, you have you should have at least one of these. But that isn't actually how validators and the many of our kind of authoring community operates today. So even though the comment indicates remove the cardinality on the parent element, we actually have to remove it on both this and the slice for it to have that impact. We can keep, my understanding is, if we have further things on coding and system, like further down the path in the slice, that we can have cardinality constraints on that. But at the slice level, a min of 1 here means a min of 1 at the parent level. I wish we had a little bit more control than that, but that's what we found out in the last year or so. So we have to remove that if we're going to have this be an optional element. And putting a constraint to carry the conditional expectation on using this if category is supported. So there might be a couple different approaches to this. Is this something that we want to try to target through a invariant or through a usage note? Or we don't really have that kind of cardinality option that we used to have. What other options am I missing for conditional expectations? I think it's just that. And then so I'm less crazy about creating an invariant, but let's maybe talk through it. So, I think the idea here is that what we want to say is if you populate it, it should be this. But, and that's because I think the difference between this profile and the report note is a different category, but let's just check that. Actually, there's no slicing on this one at all. So there is a terminology constraint, but not necessarily category 1. Okay, so this is basically saying, I'm just going to read a little bit more of the rationale for the removal and the DDR issue. So some labs indicate category on a different resource, meaning service request. Interesting. Okay, so actually I read this as that there wouldn't be any category at all, right? Is this how other people are reading this? You guys can still hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm reading this rationale to mean that removing the cardinalities because there are labs that may not supply category element at all. Do we think that we need to put some type of constraint further down that enforces this? Where if you supply category, then at least one of them should be lab. Because the only thing that's making me question this is because like it says if category is supported in a later implementation, which I think means if we were to tighten this in the future, then we need this conditional expectation.
I'm just trying to think out loud here, because this is specifically the lab profile, right?
Yep, this is specifically diagnostic report lab, yep.
Yes, but you might provide a more specific category than the generic lab. You might provide, say, chemistry or microbiology. If we did that, would we also want to have the category lab there? I've seen some instances that has multiple codings and has laboratory and then chemistry. But I'm not sure exactly what our expectations of what will happen in the field is.
I think if we were to have an invariant that made it so that if category was supplied, at least one should be like lab result would result in or actually, you know what, the way this is actually phrased is that if you're going to supply it a category, then the coding system has to come from this V2 value set. So let's see if that has the microbiology, like the options.
Yeah, it does. And that makes sense. I think here in BC, our plan is to use lab or MB or whatever the appropriate pathology. I think it's PAT. Not specifically lab, but one of those three out of the V2 set.
And so for you guys, this constraint as we have it actually isn't terrible because you already have the V2 set, you're going to pull something from it. But the scenario where it might be troublesome would be if a lab was using something outside of this V2 and it would force you to have multiple codings, at least one of them coming from this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, but what would be a problem potentially is forcing you to have the code that says laboratory when what you wanted to put was MD for microbiology.
Exactly. Then that's confusing because lab looks
Yeah.
like it says general laboratory and it's not.
Mm-hmm. So, because right now, the way we originally had it, said if you had a category, not only did it have to come from that code system, but at least one of them for this profile had to be lab. And I don't think that's exactly what we want to say.
Yep. And that isn't necessarily enforced right now. Like it's the actual code portion where it has to be LAB isn't enforced, probably because we removed it in a prior change. The only concern I have of kind of leaving this is that what we're effectively doing is we're just saying this is an open slice, and what if you're modeling for lab result, then you're going to supply this system, but there's like no other kind of discriminator.
What's our binding strength on that?
There's nothing right now on diagnostic report category. Like we haven't applied a true binding here. It's in binding is, oh, it's not even used here. Okay, so we're not actually applying a binding in the profiles for diagnostic report category.
That might be a more appropriate way to deal with this, is to make that a preferred binding or an extensible binding.
What do folks think? More preferred than either leaving as is or making some conditional invariant?
I mean, leaving it as is simple, and I think a preferred binding would be more instructive for somebody who is trying to figure out a path forward. I tend to agree with that.
So like removing the slicing because it's overkill and switching to a more common profiling methodology.
I kind of like the slicing because based on what I saw in the CI baseline, that's why we're using that approach. And I found that to be pretty, like I say, it was pretty informative. It's like, oh, I know what to do here. But it's apples and oranges. I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen of another.
Yeah,
really.
in some ways. I mean, I guess the question is, what are we trying to say with the slice precisely? Are we just trying to say that if the coding is present, then um, we want it to come, at least one of them to come from that value set. Is that what we're trying to say?
Yeah. When I'm reading, so I'm just gonna read this out loud. So I'm reading our comment. So, multiple categories are allowed using various categorization schemes, but at least one shall come from the FHIR defined value set that includes codes from this table, is the comment we've got on the slice.
I mean, the slice is a more nuanced way to say what I just said
Yeah.
than simply going back to the preferred binding.
Yeah. In my case, I did have to create a further slice, add in a battery discipline and battery heading. And because that's the case, it was, again, it was easy to take the existing slice and just kind of add to it. But I mean, that's not going to be everybody's situation.
Has anyone had trouble with it to date? Because that might also be like, if we haven't had any trouble and we're addressing the min one removal, then what we could do from this perspective is just indicate that we've kept the slice, but remove the cardinality. And, you know, in a future release, if we find, hey, people are really struggling with the reslicing of this, remove it then, or change, you know, change the approach then.
Yeah, I think leaving it this way is appropriate because in some ways it's slightly beyond the ticket we had, right? Because the ticket was primarily around cardinality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would be happy with, you know, doing it this way.
It ain't broke.
Okay. So it's this one, I think, last one. Okay. So then what I will do then is save this, run publisher, and then while it's running, should walk you guys through the next steps from like the editor's perspective. So the idea is once we've addressed the tickets, we make sure that the changes populate the changes that we're expecting from our, you know, a human rendering view, don't introduce additional errors. So we'll check that in a second, but just with time in mind, because I'm looking at the 4-minute mark, I'm just going to set us up for the next set of things. So let's just say on the assumption that publishes the way that we want on our local machines, we're happy with it. It doesn't introduce additional errors. Whenever I am getting ready to commit something, I haven't yet to figure out how to get our ignore file to consider everything, but I always uncheck some of these cache files that update every single time you run the build. And I recheck the ones that I have physically changed for that particular ticket. So I'm going to start that process now. Of effectively, anything that we were targeting from that diagnostic report, and then this one, immunization, these that all had to do with that reference targets on the ticket, I'm going to add in. Now, sometimes, you know, if maybe I have a branch that I'm putting multiple tickets on and I didn't distinctly name them, I do try wherever possible to indicate the actual tickets here. So wish I could just copy this. And what that basically just says is, you know, these are the things that have been applied in this commit, but I'm just going to make sure, because actually I think there's one that we didn't touch on this call, and it might be 1752. Let's see. I think it was the one that was on the pre-adopting a report extension, 2186. So because I didn't apply that yet, I'm just going to remove this one. And indicate changes. Ooh, there's actually one other change that we have. This ticket technically that we were just working on indicated that we should be applying it on the change on the note profile as well. So I'll make that change as well. And profiles that reference them. Here it was to category. Yeah, min of 1. Okay. So not quite modeled the same way, but making sure that we are meeting the tickets request to remove those. Yeah, any of the diagnostic report profiles. Okay, so I'll save that. And both of them are still must support. One has that additional lab modeling. We'll just confirm that that works. So my step following a successful publication is that committing is really kind of a 2-step process. The first time that you commit, of course, it's going to be, just make sure I'm logged in with the right one. It's telling me I don't have, I'm using an alternative identity right now. So you should be able to re-authenticate and then have access to CA baseline. If you don't have access to CA baseline, you get the same message and you're logged in. Just let us know. Effectively, we just need to give you right privileges. So the first step is to commit this, to basically say these are changes that are pending the publication to the branch, the branch that I specifically created. You also have to go through the step of making sure that once, let's just say, I'm going to do it right now, but you've got maybe multiple commits that are in place. Maybe you do them across, multiple days. You always have to push back to the origin branch. And what this is effectively going to do is just push the changes from your local computer from that commit into this branch here. And similarly, in GitHub, it isn't going to change the master yet, but we need to create a pull request for it to be considered for merging into the master. So I will typically create a pull request, and sometimes I'll tag a secondary reviewer. So oftentimes I'll tag Elliot, or people will tag me. Anyone that can just have a second pair of eyes on it that we know has been reviewing the repo recently. We would just indicate, it carries over any of the commit names into the pull request. So before I issue this, I wanted to show you guys the step. Before I put in the pull request, I'm going to make sure that I built the way that I wanted to. And I know we're at time, but I'm just going to make sure. And that I didn't introduce additional changes that I wasn't comfortable with. And it looks like these were the ones that were on the thing before. We'll just take a quick peek at the rendering. Make sure the titles, everything came out the way that we wanted to. Even though it's simple changes, it's still the step that we always need to perform just to make sure before it would get merged into the actual main branch. And then here's the other thing, because I went and I looked, I remember now that we also have another thing within the page markdown files that indicate required elements. So there's the third step that I've missed, which is the change to the actual markdown file as well. So before I put in my pull request, I'm going to make that change in the markdown file, and then I'll commit it to my branch, and then that one will also be considered as part of the pull request before I issue it. So I'll just, before we cut off, I'll just show you guys. So again, it's in that page content folder, and then I find specifically the intro is the one I was looking at. So, even if you've seen this before, it's still a little bit of a refresher on, kind of our processes, and really it isn't that overwhelming when you actually see that, there's going to be a second pair of eyes or a third pair of eyes that's looking at the things that you're putting through. And that, many of our tickets are kind of easy to kind of pick up and drop off. So thank you for giving me a few extra minutes of your Friday. I am going to make that change just now on the markdown, and I'll put in the final pull request. And is there anyone that wants to review it Is there a secondary reviewer? Otherwise, I'm gonna have to nominate poor Elliot, who constantly has to perform secondary reviews. All right, then, that's gonna be our Christmas gift to Elliot. Otherwise, I will see many of you next Friday. And, if I don't, I will see you in the new year. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.